Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our assignment on GDP. Remember, GDP is what we were covering in the last video. It's gross domestic product, and it values the final value of all goods and services produced within a country within a given year. Remember, we use the final price of those goods. So we talked about a $10 pizza adds $10 to GDP. We could say that a $100,000 home adds $100,000 to GDP. And that's really important as we move on to a new topic called inflation. So the first question here that you'll be typing into is, what is inflation? So inflation is simply this. You might be thinking, I already know, it's when money loses its value. Well, that is sort of correct. The better answer for economics is an increase in the overall price level. So inflation is when the price level of all goods and services increases. There is a subtle difference, and it does kind of matter as you get into economics. Just make sure you have our definition. It'll help you kind of understand as we get deeper into some other topics. So remember, inflation is an increase in the overall price level. So what this means is from year to year, prices of goods and services change. Some of them increase, some of them decrease. We don't care about what's happened to a single good. You might say, hey, in the last year, gas has gotten cheaper, so there's no inflation. Not exactly. What we look at is the final value of all goods and services. Remember, we're in macroeconomics now. And in macroeconomics, we want to make sure we're focusing on the economy as a whole. So inflation is when the overall price level increases. All right. Well, you might say, wait, how is it calculated? Well, before we do that, we need to know what the CPI is. What the CPI is this. It's going to try to answer that question of, wait, how do we know if all the prices are increasing or decreasing? Well, the CPI stands for the Consumer Price Index. So the Consumer Price Index is simply this. It's an index or a measurement tool of the overall price level. What it's going to do is try to measure how the price level of all goods and services is changing from year to year. So the CPI stands for the Consumer Price Index, and you need to add more than that. You need to go ahead in here and add what has happened. What it does is it measures the overall price level. Okay, so the CPI is the Consumer Price Index that measures the overall price level. Now, how do you calculate it? Well, we're going to have to use a topic called the CPI market basket of goods. Okay, goods, slightly different. Okay, so what the CPI market basket of goods is this. It tells us, and you can kind of think of it as like an actual basket of goods. So think of a really, really big basket. And what we want to do is we want to know what is happening to the price level of all goods and services. Well, it would be too difficult to measure every single item that is being bought and sold around the country at a time, because there are some things that are rarely bought and some things that are bought all the time. So which one matters more or which one matters less? It's a very difficult thing to do. So what we do is Bureau of Labor Statistics and Economic Measurements and even the Federal Reserve has this rough CPI, the Consumer Price Index market basket. And what the market basket does is this. It takes the goods and services that the typical American buys in a given year or month. So it'll have the price of a loaf of bread and the price of a gallon of milk and a dozen eggs and the price of a t-shirt or a new car and a gallon of gas, an electric bill, rents, things that a typical American buys from year to year. And what it does is they have economists going around the country, all around the country right now, and they're going in different stores and simply writing down, okay, a box of Pop-Tarts is this much right now. A dozen eggs is this much. A loaf of bread is this much money. And they try to keep it consistent from year to year. So they don't want to say, oh, there's a new good. What is its price? Because it's hard to measure from the previous year. So they go around, measure the price of all those goods, and they put all those goods into the kind of metaphorical market basket. So if you want to vision They put a box of Pop-Tarts and a loaf of bread and a gallon of milks and, 10 gallons of gasoline and an electric bill and rent. And they put it on the market basket and they say, how much did that cost? So let's just say, for argument's sake, that year one, that market basket costs $1,000. Okay. Next year, we go ahead and put all the same goods in that market basket. And now it cost us $1,100 for that market basket. So if it was year one cost us $1,000, and then in year two, it cost us $1,100, they'd look at the difference between year one and year two, and we'd realize that, well, price changed 10%. And therefore, that would be our inflation rate. So it means that prices increase from year one to year two at 10%, and therefore prices overall are changing at 10%. And we use the market basket because think of this. Some goods are almost always getting cheaper. Think of the price of TVs. Think of the price of smartphones. They're always getting cheaper. And you might say, nah, phones are getting more expensive, Mr. Wasmuth. No, the price of a phone is always getting cheaper when you use identical products. The iPhone 11 went from $1,000 and just decreased this year by about $200. Now you say, no, but the 12 is more expensive, right? But that's a different good. We always want to keep goods the same from one year to the next, because we can't say that a TV from 30 years ago is just as good as a new TV now. They're different. And therefore, we don't want to compare apples to oranges. We always want to compare apples to apples. So they're constantly adding and taking away goods in this market basket just so they can compare identical goods. An example is this: a 60-inch flat screen TV right now, you could probably go get one for like $600. But if we looked at that same TV like 10 years ago, that TV probably would have cost you like $4,000. So think, it was $4,000. Now it's like $600. So clearly some goods are always getting cheaper, like technological goods and electronics, whereas some goods are getting expensive. Food is constantly getting more and more expensive. Gas goes up and down wildly. So why do we use this market basket of goods? We use the market basket of goods so we know what's happening to prices overall and not the price of a single thing. So how do we calculate it? Make sure you kind of explain more than what I typed here about what the CPI market basket of goods is. So what does the CPI tell us? It tells us how much the overall price level has changed from one year to the next. So that's what it does. It tells us how much prices have changed overall from one year to the next. Therefore, it tells us our inflation rate or deflation, which happens some years. Perhaps this year might even have deflation once they calculate. That means the price level of everything overall actually got cheaper. We're not sure yet. We don't have all the data. So don't quote me if I'm wrong, but no one knows just yet. We're still collecting data. Now, here is your big question. How can inflation affect the calculation of GDP? Well, if you think about it for a moment, this is a really interesting thing. Remember when I said a $10 pizza adds $10 to GDP, but a $100,000 house adds $100,000 to GDP? Think about this. If in year one, a pizza is $10, but in year two, the pizza is, let's say, $12, well, think about it. Did the pizza become more valuable in year one, year two? The answer should be a hard no. Pizza is still a pizza. But if there's inflation, a pizza would count more for GDP. And this gives us a big problem. Because think about it this way. If in year two, we had 10% inflation, that means if GDP, this means if in year one, we made a certain level of goods, let's say $10 trillion of goods, In year 2, it'll say that we made $11 trillion of goods. But here's the tricky part. Let's just assume in year 1, we make the exact same amount of goods as year 2. So that means year 1, we make this much goods, and year 2, we make the exact same amount of goods. If you're understanding what GDP is, you would say that year 1 and year 2 were just as well off. GDP did not change. And you're correct. That in year 1, we make an identical amount of goods as year 2. That means GDP should be identical from year 1 to year 2. The tricky part is this. If there's 10% inflation, then in year 1, we make $10 trillion worth of goods. But in year 2, we'd make the exact same amount of goods, but it would end up being $11 trillion. Now you would say, oh, so we made $1 trillion more goods, but you need to remember what I said a moment ago. We made identical quantity of goods. So GDP should be the same. So what happened to us? Inflation increased our GDP by $1 trillion, but we didn't make any more. So GDP is telling us right now that we're $1 trillion richer or 10% richer, but we know that we're not, because from year 1, we made a certain amount of goods, and year 2, we made the exact same amount. So what inflation does is inflation would ruin our calculation of GDP, because it would increase the price level, meaning that the GDP from year 1, even though it should be identical to year 2 in this example, it would be 10% higher. That is what inflation does to GDP. It takes GDP from year 1 to year 2 and would inflate that number even though we didn't produce goods and services. So that's what you should be writing for E. Now, some of you guys might be really smart and you're going, wait, if that's true, GDP is meaningless from year 1 to year 2. And you're kind of right. GDP from year 1 to year 2, because we have inflation, means that we can't calculate or have an accurate prediction of what GDP did from year 1 to year 2, because prices are always changing. That is why we won't use GDP in this class. Now, if you watch the beginning of the first video and I said, we're going to use GDP all the time, you're correct. And I also just said we won't really be using GDP, which you're also kind of correct. Because it's time for us to get real and focus on what is real GDP. So we will be using GDP for all of macroeconomics, but we'll be using a type of GDP called real GDP, sometimes called RGDP. The R stands for real. So what is real GDP? Real GDP is GDP with inflation taken into account. Okay, so what is real GDP? It's GDP with inflation taken into account. So let's go ahead and look at this. Let's say that, remember, year 1 to year 2, we made an identical amount of goods. So hold on. Sorry for all the clicking. So if we had GDP right here from year 1, and we said that we made $10 trillion of goods, then we had GDP for year 2, and we made $11 trillion of goods. Even though we know we made an identical amount of goods, we know that there's 10% inflation. So if we calculated there's 10% inflation, and year 1 we made 10 trillion, and year 2 we made 11 trillion, what real GDP would do is say, wait, if there's 10% inflation, we need to decrease, what we call a GDP deflator, decrease the $11 trillion GDP by 10%. If we do that, the real GDP for year 2 would be, well, you got it, $10 trillion, because it would give us the real GDP of that year. So just to simplify and kind of go over that again, real GDP, the definition is it's GDP with inflation taken into account. That's your definition. That's what you guys should be writing in here. But to explain it, to make sure you guys understand it, is we'd have year one. Remember, year one and year two, we make the identical amount of goods, but we add up year one's final prices and it's 10 trillion. We add up year two's final prices and it's 11 trillion. But I already said we made the same amount of goods, and that's because there was inflation. So what we do is we take year one, we look at year two, we take the CPI and go, wait, CPI said inflation was 10%. So if inflation's 10%, we need to take year two and decrease it by 10%, which would give us $10 trillion. So therefore, the real GDP of year one would be 10 trillion, and the real GDP of year two would be 10 trillion as well. So what does real GDP do? Real GDP gives us what happened to the price level, or I'm sorry, how much we produced with inflation taken into account. So we know how much we really produced using a base year price level. So that's what we're going to use all the time, is real GDP. So why is real GDP a better measure of economic growth than just GDP? Because real GDP gives us the actual measure of production increase and not just a measure of how prices changed from one year to the next. So what are you putting in here? You're putting in, remember, real GDP is giving us an accurate measure of production and not just how much prices change from one year to the next. That's what you want to put in there for what's the difference between real GDP and GDP. Okay, you might want to rewind the video again and kind of go over what I was doing with all these numbers so that you have a good idea of what to put there, because you do need to know the difference. Okay, so now we've answered why is real GDP important. It's the most important measure because that's what we're going to be using. It's just GDP with inflation taken into account. And it's better because it takes the inflationary aspect of GDP, which would ruin our measurements, and it takes it into account. So we have a real measure of GDP. Now, what we're going to go ahead and do here is this. Is GDP the right metric? There are a lot of people who complain about GDP, which is what your Ed Puzzle video is going to help you out with. So there are several things GDP does not count. You'll see a whole bunch of them in the video. It's things like black market transactions aren't counted, environment, health, education. None of those are counted in GDP, but we still use GDP to say how we're doing as an economy. And you're like, well, we should include things like how the environment's doing, how clean our air is, how good our education system, how good our health is. But those aren't included in GDP, including this, like, if we have a beautiful forest, that doesn't count for GDP at all. But if we cut that forest down and build a parking lot, and that parking lot costs $2 million to build, well, GDP increased by 2 million. And you're like, well, what about the environment that we lost? Well, that doesn't count. So the GDP is far from perfect. Why are those things not counted in GDP? The video will help you with this too. It's just too hard to count. If we said, hey, but why don't we count that video, or I'm sorry, that forest? Well, how much is a forest worth? Can you give me a dollar amount? How happy you are, how do I measure how happy you are? How do I measure how good your health is, or your education, or air quality? And how do I measure that in an amount that I can value it compared to other people and countries like that? It's incredibly difficult to do. And if you know anything about statistics, if you put garbage numbers in, you get garbage numbers out. There are all kinds of happiness indexes out there, but they vary wildly because how do you measure how happy or how healthy or how well educated a person is? Different schools, different quality. It's almost impossible to do. So I want you to answer this one on your own, but I'm going to give you a caveat and I'm going to grade it based on this caveat. Should we use real GDP or something else? Remember, with real GDP, I can tell you exactly how many tons of steel were produced, exactly how many Pop-Tarts were sold, how many bridges were built, how many massages were given, how many lawns were mowed by a lawn mowing company. I can measure all of that exactly. So I can give you exact data from one year to the next, to the next, to the next. However, If you want to include things that are important, like happiness and healthcare, you're going to have to explain why you want to use something else. Because remember, everything has a cost. So I'm telling you right now, if you say GDP has problems, we shouldn't use it, that's fine. Explain your answer thoroughly, including the cost of measuring other things. What should we use and why it's better? If you just say we shouldn't use GDP because it doesn't include things, I'm marking you wrong. You need to say what we would use, but also identify its problems. A thorough answer is required for this. So this is going to get graded harshly. So put some thought into it and don't go, oh, there's a problem. Let's use the other thing. Well, the other thing has a big problem. It's hard to measure, whereas GDP is easy to measure. And if you're like, we should use GDP, it's easy to measure. Well, you got a big problem too, because there's tons of important things that it doesn't measure. So make sure you explain your answer thoroughly. Make sure that you go ahead and save your work, and most importantly, upload it to Canvas. And once you've uploaded, you must take that 10 seconds and make sure that you uploaded the assignment correctly. Remember, if you're using Chrome and you don't save it right and submit a blank assignment, well, you submitted a blank assignment. That's how it works, and that's the grade you'll get. So good luck, guys, and I look forward to seeing you back in school soon. Take care.